An earring was found on the driveway of Suzanne Flores' home. The earring appeared to have dried blood on it. Now, the same person that found the earring also shared a potentially vital anecdote that each night at around 4:20 a.m. she was awoken to the sound of a beeping emanating from the garden, which sounded like a digital watch alarm. Kristin's parents would later say that at the time of her disappearance she was working as a lifeguard at the university's rec centre, and every morning her watch alarm would go off to ensure that she was at the pool for 5 a.m.
Tonight there's been a major break in a 25-year-old mystery. A father and son are now in custody in connection with the 1996 disappearance and murder of college student Kristin Smart.
This is Murder Maps.
Today, we will be plotting out every key detail of the Kristin Smart disappearance on a map.
My name is Kenton and I'm a senior reporter for dailymail.com. Let's start by taking a look at the victim in this case, Kristin Smart. Kristin Smart was born on February 20th, 1977 in Augsburg, Germany. Her parents were both teachers and they taught children of military personnel stationed in Germany. Kristin was the eldest of 3 siblings. Kristin lived in Germany for the first 3 years of her life before her parents located to Stockton, California, back in the United States. And we have a map of Stockton here in front of us. Kristin's parents said she was her siblings' biggest cheerleader, and the 3 of them shared an incredibly close bond. She was described by her loved ones as adventurous and kind, and somebody that had a very quiet confidence about her. Despite suffering with ADHD, she excelled in school, particularly in sports such as swimming and water polo. So Kristin lived in Germany for the first 3 years of her life before her parents located to Stockton, California, back in the United States, where they picked up jobs as teachers. Stockton is an economically and culturally diverse city of around 300,000 people, 80 miles east of San Francisco.
So this is Stockton, California, where Kristin grew up. It's a safe community in the Central Valley of California. This is what it looks like when you click around on Street View a little bit.
She graduated from Stockton's Lincoln High School in 1995, which was right there.
And here's that high school on Street View.
Kristin grew up in the north side of Stockton, and she spent her free time hanging out with friends, going to the arcade, participating in youth theatre. Outside of that, she loved to explore, get out into nature, go hiking, swimming. And she loved listening to music, reading poetry, spending time in the ocean. And she also was a babysitter for other children in her neighbourhood. And before she went away to university, she spent her summer, which her parents described as a dream job, working as a lifeguard at a camp in Hawaii.
So it looks like the camp is actually still there. We can see it in some of these aerial shots on Google Maps. And here's what it looks like when you click around on Street View outside of the camp.
In 1995, Kristin Smart enrolled in California State Polytechnic University in San Luis Obispo, which is otherwise known as Cal Poly SLO. I think this case has stood the test of time because this happened in what was considered to be a very tranquil town. Kristin was a young, bright, promising young woman who seemed to have the world at her fingertips. And in one innocent night of celebration, tragedy struck, and all of a sudden she was gone without a trace. And what followed her disappearance was a series of missteps conducted by the police, which caused outrage in the local community and among Kristin's loved ones. And it's really Kristin's family's dedication to keeping her name alive, to maintaining scrutiny on police, that I think has really, really helped to keep the story alive, keep her name alive, and ultimately led to a semblance of justice emerging. Now let's take a closer look at the plot of this case. So here is Cal Poly SLO in the middle of San Luis Obispo.
I've actually spent a good amount of time in SLO and at Cal Poly. A few good friends of mine went there. Here's the campus, and here's the main street downtown. It's a really nice place to be.
More than 20,000 students attend Cal Poly, which makes up for nearly half of San Luis Obispo's population. And the town of SLO has a really good reputation for being a very safe and tranquil place. It's the kind of place where residents leave their doors unlocked, and it's also described as a close-knit community. Kristin lived here at the Muir Hall dorm on campus, which is just there.
Here is Muir Hall on Street View, right in the center of campus. It's basically a quintessential college dorm with bunk beds and shared bathrooms and common spaces.
So on the night of her disappearance, Kristin went out with one of her friends from Muir Hall, Margarita Campos, and the two of them wanted to celebrate the end of their freshman year and the end of finals week, so they went out with the aim of hoping that they stumbled across a party somewhere. It was also Memorial Day weekend, so a lot of the students were out of town, which meant parties were going to be hard to come by. They did actually end up stumbling upon a party. It was a small gathering of a few friends that were sitting around talking, playing video games. Margarita and Kristin stayed for a few hours. Each of them had one beer, and Margarita was kind of bored with the function and decided that she wanted to go back to the dorm, but Kristin was determined to stay out. So the two girls went their separate ways. After Margarita went home, Kristin continued on, and she eventually ended up at 135 Crandall Way, where she discovered another party. So the party at 135 Crandall Way, where Kristin ended up by herself, was right around here. Property was home to an unofficial frat house.
Here's that frat house. It's on one of the many quaint residential streets in Slough near the Cal Poly campus.
So 135 Crandall Way was roughly a 10-minute walk from where Kristin lived at Muir Hall. So numerous partygoers testified later on that they didn't see Kristin drinking at the party, but she did appear to be intoxicated. So there was a reported spate of campus spiking incidents at Cal Poly at the time, and many believe that Kristin may have fallen victim to one of those that night. At approximately 2 a.m. the following morning, Kristin Smart was found passed out on the front lawn outside of that party as the party was coming to an end. It was one of the hosts of the party, Tim Davis, that was first to discover Kristin. He noticed that she was passed out. He walked over to make sure she was okay, managed to rouse her, but the walk back was obviously around 10 minutes and Kristin was in no fit shape to go by herself. So Tim Davis offered to walk her home. That's when another student, Cheryl Anderson, offered to help. She lived nearby Kristin in a nearby dorm to Muir Hall. So just before they were about to set off to return Kristin home, out of nowhere came another student, Paul Flores, who also offered to help. So again, there's 3 students now helping Kristin Smart get home, which is again approximately around a 10-minute walk from campus.
Here's what that walk may have looked like.
So Tim Davis, who was the first to discover Kristin, turned back eventually, and then that just left Cheryl Anderson with Kristin and Paul Flores. So the walk home was slow. They had to keep stopping to prop Kristin up. Paul told Cheryl Anderson that she could go on ahead if she wanted to, but ultimately she decided to stay around because she thought Paul was behaving slightly creepily. When Anderson reached the turnoff to her dorm, she made Paul Flores promise that he would take Kristin the rest of the way home. He assured her he would, and before Anderson left, apparently Paul Flores asked her for a kiss, which she refused. He then asked her for a hug, which she also refused. And again, she thought Paul Flores was behaving slightly creepily. Cheryl Anderson then watched as Paul Flores, who was 3 inches shorter than Kristin Smart, walked away with her into the darkness with his arm around her waist. That was the last time anybody ever saw her alive. He told police he walked Kristin as far as his dorm, which is right here, and let her walk the rest of the way.
Here's the dorm where Paul Flores lived. It's about a 5-minute walk up the path to Muir Hall, which was Kristin's dorm.
During his first interview, Paul Flores told police that he watched Kristin Smart walk up the pathway to Muir Hall before turning back to his dorm, Santa Lucia Hall, which is this one here. Something that's important to note is on the night of her disappearance, Kristin didn't have any money, ID, or credit cards with her. Kristin Smart was never seen again. Now we're going to take a look at the accused, Paul Flores. So he grew up in San Pedro, California, a neighborhood outside of Los Angeles.
Here's what San Pedro looks like on Street View.
Just as a reference, it's about 208 miles away from Cal Poly Slough, which is there. So in high school, Paul Flores struggled to make friends, and apparently a lot of his classmates referred to him under the nickname Scary Paul. His parents would later tell investigators that their son was a serial loner. They said during his high school years they bought a pool table in the hope that it would attract other kids from the neighborhood to their home to hang out with their son. But ultimately that plan failed, and Paul Flores left high school without any close friends to his name. So Paul's lack of popularity and his negative reputation followed him to Cal Poly. He was known for being a creep, especially to women, making unwanted advances on them, which earned him the moniker Chester the Molester. 5 months before Kristin disappeared, Slough police received a call from a panicked young woman who claimed that there was an individual climbing her trellis and trying to break onto her balcony. That man was Paul Flores. No charges were filed in that case, but it was an example of how Paul Flores' disturbing behaviour began during his earlier years and continued through his college years. Now let's map out the investigation. Cal Poly police originally believed that Kristin Smart had gone on vacation without telling anyone and delayed starting a missing persons investigation for 72 hours. And often in missing persons cases, the first 48 hours of a search are the most crucial. Anything beyond that, the chance of finding them diminishes incredibly. The campus police's response to Kristin's disappearance was disastrous and is blamed today for many of the unknowns that still plague the case. So in the hours after Kristin was last seen alive, her roommate returned to their dorm and found that many of her belongings, including her wallet, her bag, her ID, were all still in the room, which indicated to her that Kristin hadn't come home that night. So when Kristin's friend Margarita Campos heard that she hadn't returned to her dorm that night, she went to Cal Poly Police and tried to file a missing persons report, aware that something was clearly wrong. But unfortunately, Margarita was told that because Kristin was over the age of 18, they had to wait more than 24 hours before starting that process. Around 72 hours would pass after Kristin was last seen before a proper investigation was launched by Cal Poly Police. By the time Kristin's parents were notified, they knew something was gravely wrong. Paul Flores wasn't immediately interviewed by campus police, and worse still, their officers failed to secure his dorm room, meaning that key evidence was likely lost. Cal Poly was surrounded by trees and hills and canyons, which you can see surrounding it here.
Around SLO, there are all kinds of canyons and hiking trails. The school has this great architecture program where students will build structures that often end up out there. Here's what a lot of those trails look like.
So soon after her disappearance, search parties were sent out into these remote areas surrounding the school, searching for any evidence of where she may be. And Kristin's father spent months going between SLO and Stockton, chasing down every lead that the family independently was getting from tipsters. And volunteer search crews were conducting their own searches in and around these canyons, which were fairly extensive too, but again, nothing of value turned up. Eventually, police searched Kristin's room at Muir Hall, which again, just to remind you, is here. Cal Poly Police didn't search Kristin's dorm until June 5th, and Paul Flores's dorm room wouldn't be searched for another 5 days after that. That's more than a week since Kristin was last seen alive. So again, Cal Poly Police never secured Paul Flores's dorm room, and days after Kristin's disappearance, Paul Flores actually cleared out the entire room because the school year had ended. Again, this means that key evidence was likely lost in those crucial first days of the investigation. And just as a reminder, Paul's dorm was Santa Lucia Hall, which was right next to Kristin's, roughly there. So here in Paul Flores's dorm room after he moved out, police eventually came in with cadaver dogs on 3 separate occasions. And on those occasions, the dog alerted each time to a corner of the room where Paul Flores's mattress had once been, signalling the scent of death. Adding insult to injury, investigators during the early stages of the investigation appeared to focus on Kristin's character and, in the language used in police reports, appeared to almost blame her for putting herself in a dangerous situation. So the seeming victim blaming, combined with a lack of urgency from police, fueled public outcry and also infuriated Kristin's parents. And Kristin's parents said they had to push relentlessly for her case to be taken seriously. They paid for billboards, they hired a private investigator, and these were all efforts that they believe would have been completely unnecessary had police taken this case seriously from the start. So 4 months after Kristin's disappearance and after weeks and weeks of futilely searching for her body, Paul Flores was brought before a grand jury. Now those proceedings are confidential, but no charges were filed. After that, Kristin's family contacted their own attorney who agreed to take on the case pro bono. They immediately filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Flores. 6 months later, Paul Flores was deposed by the Smart family lawyer, but he kept quiet.
Would you state your full name for the record, please?
Paul Ruben Flores.
During the deposition, he spoke to only confirm his name and then invoked the Fifth Amendment 27 times, refusing to answer any of the questions.
What is your present residence address?
On the advice of my attorney, I refuse to answer that question based on the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution.
Eventually, the investigation led police to Rio Grande, where Paul Flores' parents both lived, but separately. So here is where Paul's mum, Suzanne Flores, lived in Rio Grande. An earring was found on the driveway of Suzanne Flores' home. The earring appeared to have dried blood on it, and the person that found it believed that it matched a necklace that Kristin was seen wearing in missing persons posters that were posted around the area at that time. Now, the Smart family were only made aware of the discovery of the earring in 1997. When they went to Rio Grande police to ask to examine it and identify it as potentially being one of Kristin's, they were told that it had been lost by an investigator and they didn't know where it was. That earring could have been the smoking gun that would have helped Kristin's family solve this case, which is again another example of how police errors bungled the early stages of the investigation. After Kristin's disappearance, Paul was living here with his dad, Ruben Flores. The two homes are separated by about 1.1 miles, which is roughly a 3-minute drive. Now, police didn't search Ruben Flores' home for up to 2 months after Kristin's disappearance, and when they did finally arrive, they didn't bring a forensic team and they didn't bring any cadaver dogs with them. They also searched his mother's home with ground-penetrating radar, They detected a disturbance in the soil, but they deemed that it wasn't worthy of further investigation, so opted not to excavate. Now, the same person that found the earring at Susan Flores' home also shared a potentially vital anecdote that each night at around 4:20 a.m., she was awoken to the sound of a beeping emanating from the garden, which sounded like a digital watch alarm. Kristin's parents would later say that at the time of her disappearance, she was working as a lifeguard at the university's rec centre, and every morning her watch alarm would go off to ensure that she was at the pool for 5 a.m. Paul Flores' parents have continually denied any involvement in Kristin Smart's disappearance, but for several years they refused to comply with the police investigation and stonewalled them at every turn. In the years that followed, Paul Flores was accused by numerous women of sexual assault. That included an accusation made by a co-worker, and additionally, 2 women would later accuse him of drugging and raping them after an encounter at a bar. Between 1996 and 2007, various searches were conducted at properties owned by the Flores family, but no arrests were made during that time. Back in Slough, Kristin Smart's parents continued to fight for justice in their daughter's case. Now let's talk about the arrest. In 2011, a new sheriff was hired, Ian Parkinson, and he promised to bring a resolution to Kristin's case. And Parkinson was true to his word. In the years that followed his appointment, he actioned more than 20 search warrants, conducted nearly 100 interviews, and gathered nearly 300 pieces of evidence. A local independent journalist, Chris Lambert, released a multi-episode series podcast called Your Own Backyard, which was based on Kristin's case. The podcast was immensely popular, and it helped to strike up a renewed public interest in the case. During the course of his investigation, Chris Lambert was able to uncover witnesses that had never previously spoken to police before. And Chris Lambert would later be credited by Sheriff Ian Parkinson for his work, saying that without Chris Lambert's investigation, then perhaps the arrest that came maybe wouldn't have been made. In March 2021, investigators searched Ruben Flores' home with cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar. Ruben's home can be seen here.
Here is Ruben's home again, and investigators were mostly interested in his back deck, which we can kind of see here on Street View.
Because of the podcast and its popularity, neighbours who surrounded the Flores' home came forward with anecdotes and never before reported eyewitness observations, one of which concerned activity in the garden of the home under the decking of Ruben Flores. Now, this happened in February 2020, and the neighbour says that they saw Ruben Flores, his ex-wife Suzanne, and her boyfriend arguing in the backyard as trailers were brought in and out, and they appeared to be digging at something in the ground. That tip prompted police to return to Ruben Flores' home with cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar. And during that search, beneath the deck, they found traces of biological evidence which indicated that a body had once been buried there. The area in question had recently been covered with plywood and dirt and was under a newly constructed part of Ruben Flores' deck. All of that evidence pointed to the theory that Kristin Smart was once buried there beneath the deck and that she was later moved by Ruben as police were closing in. In April 2021, investigators finally made an arrest. Paul Flores was charged with Kristin Smart's murder, and Ruben Flores was charged as an accessory after the fact. It is alleged that Paul Flores murdered Kristin Smart during an attempted rape inside his Cal Poly dorm room. Because of the statute of limitations, Paul Flores could not be charged with rape, but because investigators believed that he committed a murder during the act of rape, that justified a first-degree felony murder charge. Law enforcement believed that shortly after Paul Flores killed Kristin Smart that he called his dad for help. They believed that Ruben Flores helped Paul store Kristin's body somewhere temporarily and then, in a short window of time, moved her body to Rio Grande, where they later buried her. On October 18, 2022, Paul Flores was found guilty of the first-degree murder of Kristin Smart, but his father, Ruben Flores, was found not guilty of being an accessory after the fact. The reaction to those split verdicts was one mixed of relief and anger between Kristin's loved ones and the wider community. Kristin's family still believe today that multiple people helped cover up the crime, and they believe that when Kristin's body is eventually found, the truth will come out. Paul Flores was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison on March 10th, 2023. He is currently serving his sentence out here at the Pleasant State Valley Prison. And for reference, that's roughly 97.5 miles from Cal Poly Slough, which is seen there. Kristin Smart's disappearance and the slow response by campus police led to the Kristin Smart Campus Security Act being passed in 1998. The law came into effect in January 1999, and it requires campus police to open up lines of communication with other better resourced police stations in the local area when disappearances and acts of violence are recorded on campus. Kristin's name is now associated with positive change, which would help to save other lives and help solve other cases more quickly. For Kristin's family, it was important to channel their grief into positive change to ensure that no other family has to endure the same roadblocks and delays that plagued their daughter's case, which in Kristin's case delayed justice for a quarter of a century. You can visit and honour Kristin at Kristin's Point of Hope at Pismo Beach here, which is roughly a 10-minute drive from Cal Poly.
So this is Pismo Beach. It's pretty close to Cal Poly, and this is the Kristin Point of Hope, which is a beautiful viewpoint and memorial site for Kristin.
The search for Kristin's body remains ongoing. Friends and family of the missing student have urged Paul Flores to confess to where Kristin is, but so far, the convicted killer has kept his silence. Despite Paul Flores being behind bars, 3 decades later, justice has only been half served because Kristin is still missing and her family are desperate to lay her to rest.